Now, Madam President, I also want to rise to talk about the National Defense Authorization Bill, which is also coming to the floor today and is on the floor today. 65 years ago this week, a freshman senator from Maine rose on this floor in this place and made one of the most important speeches in American history. And it certainly was one of the most important speeches of the 20th century, June 1st, 1950. That freshman senator was Margaret Chase Smith of Maine. I got to know Margaret Chase Smith after she left the Senate in the 80s and 90s up in Maine before we lost her in 1995. And she told me about that speech. The speech was about the dangers to the country and particularly to this institution of the practices of Joseph McCarthy, of the smear campaigns, of the innuendo, of the threats. And her speech took enormous courage. She told me two stories about the speech that I think are interesting that I want to note before I go on to the implications of that speech for what we're considering today. One was, she said that as she had the speech in her hand and got on the little trolley to come from the Russell Building over here, and at that time the Russell Building was the only Senate office building, who should be sitting in the trolley in the seat next to her but Joe McCarthy? And Senator Smith sat down and McCarthy turned to her and said, "What are you up to today, Margaret?" And she told me that she responded, "I'm about to make a speech, Joe, and you're not going to like it." And she went on to the Senate floor, and she had written that speech with her close aide, Bill Lewis, at her kitchen table in Skowhegan, Maine, over Memorial Day weekend of 1950. She had the speech in her hand, and Bill Lewis was in the press gallery right up here. But she told him not to hand out a copy of the speech until she was well into giving it on the Senate floor because she was afraid that she would lose her nerve and not deliver the speech. That speech took enormous courage. It took enormous courage because she was telling her colleagues an uncomfortable truth. An uncomfortable truth. And I believe that today it's also important that we face uncomfortable truths. I am a strong supporter of the National Defense Authorization Act that's on the floor. I am a strong supporter of the need and the importance and how crucial that bill is to the defense and the security of this country. The most solemn responsibility we have in this place is set forth in the preamble to the Constitution itself, to provide for the common defense and ensure the domestic tranquility. That is what governments are established to do. That is the basic fundamental responsibility, to provide for the common defense and ensure domestic tranquility. That's national security. And that's what this bill that's on the floor today is all about. I worked in subcommittee on it. I've been to numerous repeated hearings, all as the presiding officer has, all through the winter and early spring, where we learned about the strategic challenges facing this country, and I commend the chair of the committee for putting this in a strategic context. And we talked about big issues with people like Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski and Madeleine Albright before we started talking about the specifics that are in this bill. And then we had lengthy subcommittee meetings and subcommittee markups. And for me, one of the most satisfying parts of my legislative experience here has been the markup of this bill, where we met as a committee, where we argued and debated and voted and had a lot of amendments and tried to deal with it for 2 solid days and came to a conclusion where, as I recall, the vote out of the committee was something like 22-4. A very powerful vote. So I am in total support of this piece of legislation. However, my problem with the legislation is that it attempts to avoid the impact of the sequester through the use of the overseas contingency account money, which is not paid for. We've had hearings. Every hearing we've had this year has been talking about the danger of the sequester to national security. And indeed, I've been working with a number of my colleagues to try to find a solution for the sequester. But the solution for the sequester is not simply to borrow the money from our grandchildren. And what bothers me about this legislation is that it's part of a pattern. When the chips are down around here, we borrow the money from our grandchildren. If 5-year-olds could vote and knew what we were doing to them, we'd all be dead ducks, because we're passing the bill on to them. I think we should fully fund the Department of Defense and the request at the level that's in this bill. I just don't think we should borrow the money to do it. And make no mistake, that's what we're doing. We're saying it's very important. These are important expenditures. It's critical for national defense that we make these expenditures, but not critical enough to pay for them. And that's the pattern. Earlier this year, we passed the so-called tax extenders. They ought to be called tax cut extenders, because that's what they are. And everybody said they were important to economic development, and they were important for the country, and they're important for certainty for businesses, and all that was true, but it wasn't enough to pay for them. We borrowed the money. Last year, we passed a major rewrite of the Veterans Administration program, where everybody talked about how important this was, how important the Veterans Affairs agency was to our veterans, how much we owed our veterans, how we had to take care of this. But then we turned around and borrowed the money from our grandchildren in order to fund it. We didn't fund it. Recently, just in the last month or so, we fixed the so-called dock fix, which has been plaguing this place for a dozen years. But we didn't really fix it. We fixed it as far as the docks are concerned, but we fixed it by borrowing the money. We didn't pay for it. Many of my colleagues talk around here a lot about the deficit and the danger to the country. I think they're right. I think the deficit is a serious danger to this country. But it seems like the deficit is only a problem when we think it's a problem, and then the next day it's not a problem anymore because we're going to borrow $38 billion more to put into this bill. I think we need to stand up and pay for things. Now, I'm no angel. I voted for all of those things that I listed. But I think it's time to start saying, wait a minute, we can't do this. And by the way, by fixing the sequester in the Department of Defense, of course, we're not fixing it anywhere else in the federal government. And some people say, well, that's okay, because defense is important and we're not so worried about these other programs. Well, I'm sorry, but some of those other programs are little items like the FBI. There has never been a time in the history of this country where the FBI is more important. We are facing serious, dangerous, imminent threats. And to not fund the FBI or the Border Patrol or the TSA, to have the sequester affect those agencies and kid ourselves that we're dealing with our national security responsibilities is just not responsible. It's just not right. And to borrow the money to fix some of these things is not responsible or fair to our grandchildren. It's also, we're saying, well, we're just going to fix defense with this funny money deal, a gimmick wrapped up in a trick, but we're not going to fix anything else. Okay, I've talked about the FBI, the TSA, Border Patrol, national security issues, but what about the NIH? What about scientific research that can save lives? That we're having the sequester, we're saying, oh, it's okay, we can do that. What about education? What about, yes, Head Start, that gives young people a chance to make a serious contribution to this country? So I think the OCO trick that's in this bill is wrong on 2 counts. It's wrong on 3 counts, actually. Number 1, it's not paid for. Number 2, it's not really what the Defense Department needs. They need base budget authority so they can plan, so they can look to the future, so they can make the decisions on an ongoing basis that are necessary to commit to programs and plans and projects that will defend this country. The short-term OCO solution doesn't do that. So that's number 2. And number 3, by ignoring the needs of the rest of the federal government, by ignoring the needs of other parts of the national security apparatus, we're not serving the public we were sent here to look after. So I support this bill, but I think that we really ought to be thinking about alternative ways to fund the needs that we've identified. It's too easy to say this is an important national priority, but not important enough to pay for. We are continually, even today, after all the talk about deficits and budget control and everything else, finding ways to shift the burden to our kids and to our grandchildren. I don't think that's right, Madam President. Senator Reid of Rhode Island has an amendment to this bill that I think is an important one. And all it simply says is we're not going to spend that OCO money in defense until we solve the problem more generally throughout the rest of the federal government. Now, I realize it's not the responsibility of the Defense Department or of the Armed Services Committee to solve the overall budget problem within the defense bill. But I think we have a responsibility to look at the larger problem, and we can contribute to its solution by saying to our colleagues throughout this body and in the House that there has to be a comprehensive solution before we say we're going to fix only defense and we're only going to fix defense with borrowed money. There are three ways to solve this budget problem, Madam President, three ways. One is by cuts, and there have already been substantial cuts. From the projected budgets back in 2010, there's something like $750 billion has already been cut from defense and other areas of the federal budget. There have to be we have to continue to look at that, and we have to look at all aspects of the federal budget. The second way is revenues. Now, nobody's supposed to talk about revenues around here, but the reality is we're not paying our bills. And to pat ourselves on the back for tax cuts, when in reality we're passing the expenses on to our children, is just not honest. When we pass tax cuts here in a deficit situation and just borrow the money to fill the hole, we're not cutting taxes. We're shifting the tax to our children. I don't think that's honest. I don't think that's responsible. I don't think that's what we were sent here to do. And the third way, of course, to solve this budget problem is by economic growth. And some people say, well, the only way to grow the economy is to cut taxes. I've seen no economic study that says that works. Now, maybe it works if you're reducing the taxes as they did in 1960 from 90% top marginal rate to now about 35. Okay, I think that is significant. But to reduce that marginal rate by 2 or 3 points and say that's going to stimulate a huge amount of economic activity is that's just not, there's no economic justification for that. The two single biggest economic development projects in the recent history of the United States were the GI Bill after World War II and the interstate highway system. Both of them were investments. Both of them cost money. And by the way, our predecessors paid for them. They didn't pass the bill on to us, they paid for them. So yes, we need to control taxes. Yes, we need to think about strategic tax reductions in ways and areas that will actually help stimulate the economy. I don't understand why having some guy that's managing money in New York paying half the tax rate that his secretary makes is a stimulus to the economy. And yet that's what we're doing. We've got to be looking at this problem in a comprehensive way. We've got to look at healthcare costs. We've got to look at the effects of demographics on federal expenditures over the next 20 to 30 years. And we've got to look at investments that will help our economy to grow. So, Madam President, you and I worked hard on this bill. I think it's an important bill for the future of this country. I think it's an important bill to protect the national security, to provide for the common defense. But I think we need to do it in an honest and open way and not try to fill a short-term budget gap with money that our children and our grandchildren are going to have to repay. I believe that we can do this. I believe that we can face this responsibility because that is why we are here. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the floor.